Good evening and welcome to Panmure House. I'm Professor Adam Dixon. It's my pleasure to welcome you here on this beautiful October evening. For those of you that this is your first time at Panmure House, and it looks like there are many familiar faces, but I do see some new faces. If this is your first time, you are in the last home of Adam Smith, the so-called father of modern economics who lived here from 1778 till 1790. And as I was telling our speaker, you'll be giving your lecture tonight in the very room that Adam Smith finished his two great masterworks, the revisions thereof, The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The next year, in 2026, being the 250th anniversary of that great text, being The Wealth of Nations. Now, Smith did not write The Wealth of Nations as an academic exercise. Indeed, he wasn't even a professor when he started to write The Wealth of Nations. He had long retired from that career. He wrote it to answer an urgent and enduring question. Why do some nations prosper while others languish? And that question remains as vital today as it was in 1776. Now, this evening marks the inaugural Panmure House NIESR annual lecture, a new partnership between Panmure House and one of the UK's leading economic research institutes. And I want to offer particular thanks to Professor Adrian Pabst, NIESR's deputy director, whose support has been instrumental in bringing this collaboration to life. Our ambition is simple but serious: to create a space where leading minds can challenge conventional thinking about the UK economy with the same intellectual courage and practical wisdom that defined the Scottish Enlightenment. Each annual lecture will confront the hard questions about Britain's economic future, not with ideology, but with evidence, not with partisan politics, but with serious analysis, and not with easy answers, but with the kind of clear-eyed insight policymakers and business leaders actually need. As we continue to work towards developing Panmure House into a leading global think tank, tonight's lecture also launches our new Economic Dynamism program, one of several programs through which Panmure House explores how the principles that generate prosperity apply to the challenges of our time. Economic dynamism is not simply about GDP growth or quarterly statistics. It is about the deeper conditions that enable economies to innovate, adapt, and create broad-based prosperity. It is about what Smith understood, that wealth does not arise from zero-sum competition or resource extraction, but from the productive energies of free people solving problems and meeting needs. And so the UK today faces a fundamental question about its own dynamism. Despite remarkable strengths, a world-class financial sector, leading universities, innovative firms, and robust institutions, we are confronting what many describe as stagnation. Growth is weak, productivity lags, investment is subdued. The barriers Sir Keith will discuss tonight are not technical glitches with technical fixes. They are structural challenges that demand deeper thinking about what enables or constrains a nation's capacity to create prosperity. We could not have a better guide for that discussion than Sir Keith Skeoch. Keith brings more than 40 years of experience combining analytical rigor with commercial leadership at the highest levels. He joined Standard Life Investments in 1999 as Chief Investment Officer, became CEO in 2004, and joined the Maid Board after demutualization in 2006. Under his leadership, the firm expanded dramatically in assets under management, global reach, and capability. He went on to serve as CEO of Standard Life plc and later of Standard Life Aberdeen, leading its transformation into a focused global investment house. But this is more than a story of corporate success. It is a career spent on the front lines of capital allocation, understanding what drives investment, what deters it, and how regulation and policy shape economic outcomes in practice, not theory. This combination of institutional leadership, capital markets expertise, and engagement with economic policy makes Keith an ideal speaker for this inaugural lecture and embodies exactly the kind of conversation Panmure House exists to foster. While tonight's lecture focuses on the UK, its themes resonate far beyond. How can advanced economies sustain dynamism amid geopolitical tension, technological upheaval, and demographic change? What structural reforms are necessary, not desirable, to revive productivity and growth? And how do we move from diagnosis to action? These are not only British questions. They are shared questions of all developed economies that are seeking to maintain innovation, opportunity, and rising living standards. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations, there's something profoundly fitting about using Adam Smith's own home as a forum for such debate. Smith would recognize tonight's questions, even if our context has changed. The enduring challenge remains understanding what allows societies to flourish and having the wisdom and courage to pursue those policies even when they are difficult. Tonight's lecture, The State of the Economy, Reconnecting Risk, Capital, and Labor to Revive UK Growth, goes to the heart of what true economic dynamism requires. Not quick fixes or single policy levers, but a renewal of the fundamental relationships between the forces of production, and a reckoning with whether our current systems enable or inhibit them. Sir Keith Skeoch brings both the analytical clarity and the practical experience to illuminate that challenge. It is a privilege to welcome him to Panmure House for, again, the inaugural Panmure House NIESR annual lecture. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Sir Keith Skeoch. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that kind and gracious introduction. It's a real privilege for me to be invited by Panmure House and NIESR to talk about this quintessential topic that appears to generate unmitigated gloom in whatever media channel grabs your attention at the moment. As Adam said, nearly 250 years ago, Adam Smith set out the first formal framework for analysing the nature and causes of prosperity, founding the subject of economics and stimulating a debate that is not only still alive, but highly relevant to the state of the economy today. The National Institute for Social and Economic Research was established in 1938, hard on the heels of the founding of macroeconomics. And it looked to fill a gap and provide independent, rigorous research on economic and social issues that would be relevant to policy, a quest, I feel, that's equally relevant to the matters at hand. Building on these foundations, my intention over the next 40 minutes or so is to look at the state of the economy relative to its very long history, the ideas that not only form the current conventional wisdom, but also lie behind the trade-offs and choices policy must apply itself to, and also to give any non-economists in the room a sense of context. I think it's fair to say that whilst the tools and techniques available to the modern economist are beyond Smith's wildest dreams, possibly giving him nightmares, the fundamental question that Smith was attempting to answer back in 1776 remains, as Adam pointed out, how does an economy organise its resources and effort to grow its wealth for the benefit of society so those in it can flourish? The way in which that question's been answered has changed through time. But if you drill really deep, there are actually very few paradigms that have dominated how economists think about the world. Smith, along with John Stuart Mill, emphasised a system of natural liberty which harmonised self-interest and social interest, allowing markets to operate without government. About 100 years on from the Wealth of Nations, economists recognise that in some circumstances, actually, markets don't coordinate divergent interests, and governments do have a role as an efficient coordinating force. This marginalist school of economics actually dominated microeconomic thoughts pretty much until the late 1970s, when the pendulum swung back to the market, the magic of market efficiency through public choice theory, which, in contrast to Smith's natural processes, emphasises constitutional issues, contracts, and the credibility of policymakers. It provides the intellectual foundations for all of the focus on the big principal agent issues that are so central to the economic debate today. Stewardship issues for investors, the concept of bail-in bank capital to protect the taxpayer, as well as the independence of central banks, and of course, the adherence to fiscal rules. Credibility and the need to build trust are central themes that resonate in the current economic debate. While these paradigms shape the way we think about economic systems and interactions within them, of course, they don't really represent what's commonly understood by economic policy. For most people, this relates much more to the macro side of the economy, output growth, unemployment, inflation, interest rates, and that simplifying idea of a benign policymaker acting in the public good. Macroeconomics, of course, has a much shorter history and was born in 1936 with the publication of Keynes' general theory. And like its older sister, macroeconomics has also undergone its own metamorphosis from the neoclassical synthesis post-war and demand management through monetarism and the control of inflation to real business cycle and my absolute favorite, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. One of the great goals in economics has actually been to integrate macro and micro into a single theory. And to do so, we saw rational expectations emerge and utilize the rather heroic assumption that everyone understands how the economy works and acts rationally using this knowledge when making economic decisions. That had quite a profound impact on model building and the subsequent development of monetary theory. Real business cycle theory, on the other hand, argues that business fluctuations are the result of shocks to the system, technology or weather, and because these shocks don't represent market failure, government shouldn't intervene in the short run. The combination of both generated dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models that became both the workhorse for independent central banks and the main mechanism that's utilized today for thinking about policy choices in a modern economy. So let's, using that, turn our attention to the outlook. But before I do, a slight word of warning that the current gloom is in very sharp contrast to what's been delivered to society since the Wealth of Nations. Real incomes in the UK have risen by a massive 16 times over the course of the last 250 years, a staggering 14 times over the last 100 years, which yielded an average growth rate of about 2.7%. Over the last 50 years, my life as an economist, if you include my undergraduate years, real incomes have more than doubled. And of course, these statistics say nothing about the improvement in and richness associated with the quality of life over these timeframes. Life expectancy has roughly doubled from just below 40 in 1776 to around 80 today. The generation born 100 years ago, the so-called golden cohort, benefited from improvements in sanitation, medical advance, and rising living standards, all helping to lift life expectancy to just below 60 years of age. It's not just life expectancy. The array of material goods and services available to us today must be mind-boggling to our forebears. Who thought when I graduated back in 1978 I'd be carrying a supercomputer around in my pocket? And as Deirdre McCloskey has pointed out, pessimism has constantly been a poor guide to the modern economic world. We are gigantically richer in body and spirit than we were 200 years ago. That certainly fits with some of my own lived experience, having entered the world of work in 1979 after completing my postgraduate studies. The outlook looked pretty bleak. Inflation in the wake of two oil shocks and a disastrous set of income policies saw inflation running just below 20%. Interest rates were rising on their way to 17%. Activity was slumping and heading into recession. Unemployment was touching new records. Interestingly, after a period where the UK had been bailed out by the IMF, we suffered a 3-day working week with regular power blackouts and rubbish was piling up in the streets. Within 5 years, inflation was brought under control, interest rates fell, activity revived, and the outlook had been transformed. For those of us that were around at the time, economic optimism ruled the roost for the next decade or so. So it's just a tiny little reminder that that radical uncertainty can turn things for the better. So, bearing that in mind, let's have a quick look at the current economic outlook and compare it with the UK's very long-run history. This table provides a simple scorecard for the key macroeconomic variables and contrasts them with our performance over the last 150 years. I've used data from 1870 onwards for two reasons. First, 100 years on from Smith, his ideas had started to influence economic policy, bringing UK mercantilism to an end. More prosaically, this was also a period when I could get a consistent and coherent set of economic data, either from the Bank of England's Millennium Data Bank or indeed the data set associated with the rate of return on everything. For consistency, the outlook is taken from the latest OBR report, but I should note that both NIESR and the consensus forecasts for 26 are deeply much more pessimistic on GDP growth and productivity. To try and avoid too much bias associated with the choice of a single benchmark, I've included a number of historical standard subsamples to remove the impact of the really big shocks that buffeted the UK economy, 2 world wars, global financial crisis, and the recent COVID pandemic. The standout feature on this scorecard is pretty much as Adam said. There's a very poor outlook for growth in GDP and particularly GDP per capita. What I find very surprising about this data is other measures of economic health, inflation, unemployment, interest rates, strangely wouldn't suggest anything unusual about the current conjuncture. I'm very surprised when I put the table together. So, of course, the economist in me instantly wanted to run a battery of statistical tests just to show what a load of rubbish this was. And when I looked for historical outliers, I only found 2. The current account of the balance of payments and the public sector net borrowing. 80% of the data on this page suggests that we're living within current experience. The issue here, of course, and I'm sure everybody in the audience has spotted it quickly, we're just looking at averages, and we need to look at the underlying dynamics. Macroeconomic phenomena are not just cyclical, but inherently noisy. And if you look at the most basic measure of prosperity, GDP per capita, you can see the year-on-year changes the data analysts and the media and the politicians obsess about is highly volatile. Over the last 150 years, using this measure, the UK has experienced 14 recessions. On average, 1 every 11 years. So the vast majority of the electorate have experienced usually 2 or 3 during their working lifetime. No wonder they're skeptical about politics and economic policy. Those recessions are also incredibly important because research tells us that these recessions and the way policy reacts to them can have a profound consequence for the future pattern of economic activity as well as the shape of domestic politics. To cut a long story short, deep recessions tend to have long-run impacts and actually cause extreme swings in political affiliations. They also, of course, do result in a different shape to economic activity. And if we look at the underlying trend growth in GDP per capita, and here I've simply used what's called a Hodrick-Prescott filter to extract the underlying trend in GDP per capita. Other filters are available. They don't really make that much difference. You can see that over the last 154 years, there has been a number of economic cycles, and there has been a significant variation in the trend rate of growth, and you've got quite significant differences in the amplitude and duration of these various economic cycles. You can see that post the Second World War, the acceleration was very, very plain to see, as was the impact of the Thatcher Revolution and the impact of the previous technology boom. However, the real standout feature, as Adam was hinting about, was if you look at the end of this chart, trend GDP on this measure has been hovering around the 0.5% per annum mark for the last 9 years. And that means it's starting to look, sadly, structural. The only other time trend growth has persistently entered this kind of territory was between the two world wars. Of course, in line with theory, we know the economy has been buffeted by two seismic shocks: the global financial crisis and the COVID pandemic, followed by a couple of sizable aftershocks, Brexit and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And arguably, we are in the middle of a third aftershock. As a relatively small open economy, we're having to deal with the Trump tariffs, which of course are yet to be reflected in this data. So it's looking at the causes and consequences of that potential diminution of the growth trend that I want to spend a little bit time looking at. The conventional explanation for this slowdown, in line with the sort of prevailing paradigm, the economic thought, is pretty straightforward. The size of these shocks and the uncertainty they created have had a dramatic effect on both productivity and investment, where the UK has fared poorly relative to both its history and its competitors. Multi-factor productivity in the key business sector, again stripping out a trend, you can see has been flatlining at very low levels since basically the financial crisis. This has caused a good deal of concern because not only is that trend slower than other major international economies, but it continued to decline despite the bounce back in economic activity after that deep COVID recession. Recent research suggests that actually this can be very easily accounted for by slowdowns in the productivity in certain sectors, parts of manufacturing, information and telecommunications, transportation, and of course, finance. where the UK was particularly exposed to the global financial crisis. There's a huge body of work on UK productivity and how to improve it, including some excellent work at the Productivity Institute, which for the purpose of this lecture, I don't need to repeat. However, we do need to note that multi or total factor productivity is not susceptible to either short-run or macroeconomic fixes. Its key determinants are long-run phenomena. For example, the creation, transmission of knowledge or technology, which influences not just the quality of capital, but the way in which it's organized. These, in turn, are influenced by even deeper determinants: an economy's institution, the competitive environment, including something I'll talk about a little bit later, its capital allocation mechanisms. Many would point out that the underlying issue is the UK's poor investment rate, which, like multi-factor productivity, is in trend decline. And the latest data suggests that business investment has fallen to about 19.2% of GDP, the lowest in the G7. While they are surely correct, in my view, it's the questions about the capital allocation mechanisms and its associated institutions that are critical to the restoration of trend growth and productivity. And it's a matter I'll return to in a couple of minutes. What is clear is that if the UK remains stuck in a low productivity state, it will be a binding constraint in our ability to deliver the long-run improvement in prosperity effectively delivered between 1776 and the recent millennium. In particular, the scope for delivering any significant macroeconomic stimulus without generating inflation is limited to non-existent. Sadly, from my perspective, and looking at the conjunction of the current data, this isn't the only constraint that's likely to bind on the UK's ability to generate a positive outcome from sustained macroeconomic stimulus. Public sector borrowing and the current account of the balance of payments, which we identified as statistical outliers on the scorecard, are also structural issues. You can see quite plainly on this chart the long-term deterioration in the so-called twin deficits and implicitly the UK's increasing dependency on borrowing to finance economic activity. Of course, there's nothing wrong with borrowing per se, but the extent and nature of the UK's dependency is becoming a real concern. The most pressing issue, which is all over the papers ahead of the autumn budget, is public sector borrowing. As David Aikman, the new director at NIESR, points out in a recent blog where he updates Sargent and Wallace's some unpleasant monetarist arithmetic, the UK would need to run a primary surplus of 1 to 1.5% of GDP just to stabilise its debt GDP ratio. Actually, at the moment, it's running a deficit of around 5% of GDP and a primary deficit of around 2%. Those numbers just don't add up to a stable debt GDP ratio, which, given that the starting point is a debt GDP ratio just below 100%, is a real concern. The last time we saw a debt to GDP ratio in excess of 100% was in the years before 1960, after which it fell from a peak of 256% in 1945 to a low of 21.7% in 1990. Arguably, the current account deficit, which touched 3.8% this year, is high but less pressing. And it's less pressing for two reasons. First, the UK has a pretty strong external balance sheet, so at the moment it's relatively easily funded. Second, if you look in the financial balances within the UK economy, UK households in the second quarter of 2025 were running a financial surplus equivalent to 3.6% of GDP. Given that the corporates had a minimal net borrowing from the rest of the economy, that substantial public sector deficit can be seen as the root cause of our deficit with the rest of the world. While this facilitates the funding of the deficits at interest rates and the rough ballpark suggested by history, think back to our scorecard, those interest rates, short or long, don't look too different. I think it masks really a high degree of fragility that actually tightens the constraint on policy. The counterpart to that household financial surplus is the savings ratio. Savings ratio for the UK household sector, which is a good thing, has touched 10.7% in the second quarter. That, of course, implies a subdued rate of consumption. Guess what? Running around 0.8% per annum. That annual average rate compares with a rate of growth of 3.4% in the 30 years from 1980 to 2019, when consumer spending really was the engine of economic growth. A current account deficit that is significant relative to history and accompanied by a large public borrowing requirement is indicative of underlying imbalance in the economy and increased macro fragility. And that fragility is the result of some nasty little feedback loops that arise from the current situation, produced by those structural twin deficits. So if you allow me for a moment, just think about a thought experiment where consumption, for whatever reason, were to revive and boost economic growth back towards trends. Chances are the current account deficit would balloon. Just look at the amount of Chinese cars that are flooding in at the moment without any revival in economic activity. While strong growth would certainly help the fiscal position, it doesn't necessarily move the fragility. If we heroically assume, and it is a big heroic assumption, that a revival in growth is fast enough to shift the UK's primary fiscal deficit back to balance, a stable debt-GDP ratio, apologies for the equation, still requires the effective yield on government bonds to remain below nominal GDP growth. If the deterioration on the current account deficit were large enough, it could cause a run on the pound and push rates into territory that would actually start to lift the debt-GDP ratio further and shift the UK back towards a doom loop. Think November 2022. While the possibility is clear, it's not something that capital markets are factoring in today. And we can tell, I had a very close look at the sovereign credit default swap for the UK this morning, which was about 60% of its range. So it's slightly elevated, but certainly not very high. So to summarize, you look out at the state of the economy, I'm afraid it looks to be stuck in what I would call a subpar steady state, and it remains dependent on the fashion and whims guiding international capital markets. I'm not sure that we're yet at the mercy of the so-called bond market vigilantes, but I think, as Mark Carney put it, we are very, very dependent on the kindness of strangers. And certainly that fragility feels every bit as heightened as when I entered the world of work some 46 years ago. The circumstances are different, clearly, but it, I think, also raises questions we should be asking about the UK's long-term resilience to shocks and the long-term effects of macroeconomic policy. If policy were increasing in its effectiveness, one might expect to see both a dampened amplitude of those cycles in growth and a reduction in the perturbations around the trend. It just ain't happening. The only time these numbers show the volatility around that long-term growth rate, the only time we saw dampened volatility was in the so-called golden era from the late 1950s to the early 1970s. This volatility is also a significant multiple of the underlying trend, which suggests there's a statistical issue there. I guess the intuitive economic interpretation is that while changes in macro policy, either through the changes in instruments of policy or their settings, occasionally had positive and powerful effects on the trend rate of growth, in the long run, whether we like it or not, they just haven't been sustained. So for much of my earlier professional career, inflation, as I suggested, was public enemy number one. Today, it's much better controlled. Monetary policy, for the moment, is reasonably effective. But ask yourself the question, have we really seen the benefits from the persistently lower inflation environment? Fiscal discipline has been poor. The reduction in radical uncertainty did not materialize. Instead, we got a marked slowdown in the macro engines of prosperity, investment, and productivity. This isn't the end of the road for macro policy, but it strikes me that the options it brings to deliver a revival are very, very limited. If we assume we've learnt the lessons from the 1970s and from November 22, that a dash for growth and inflation isn't an option, there are probably two bookends for policy at the moment. Period of fiscal consolidation that sets the debt-GDP ratio on a downward trajectory, keeps inflation and interest rates well bounded, and perhaps more importantly, delivers that period of economic stability. I'll leave it to the audience to decide whether that's actually politically feasible. The other bookend is financial repression, the spectrum of policy that allows governments to reduce borrowing costs and liquidate public debt by using regulatory and institutional tools to channel domestic savings towards government financing at below market rates. Effectively, the policy that was deployed during the post-war period up until the very late 1970s. If the target is simply reducing the debt to GDP ratio and fostering the semblance of short-run stability, they're probably fine. But it's not clear to me that either would play a significant role in restoring productivity growth, the key engine for long-term prosperity. The UK's lack of resilience in the wake of radical uncertainty that's dominated the last 15 years, I think, therefore, raises much deeper questions about how the UK economy is structured, the nature of institutions and their processes, and whether they're currently set up to facilitate a return to long-term prosperity. That's a broad and complex question. I don't have time, and I probably don't have the intellect to address those issues. So for the remainder of this talk, I want to concentrate on something I do allegedly know about, and that is the savings and investment system, which is so fundamental to the efficient and effective financing and delivery and investment. I've heard it said, and they may be right, investment in AI may well save the day. but it still needs to be financed, and it still needs to make sure it lands in the right place. Before I look at that issue about savings investment, just want to leave you with a couple of very high-level remarks. First of all, I believe with a passion that any systemic change must be aimed at improving the workings of the private or broad business sector, where the bulk of our people are employed and earn their living. Second, there is some recent research from Dennis Snow and Colm Kelly pointing out that as much as we might like to think that theoretically it's possible, the conditions that allow Smith's invisible hand or the markets to weave a magic wand are just not in place. Mercantilism is making an unfortunate return, and oligopolies dominate the diffusion of the new technology to the benefit of the few in the short run rather than the many. The other thing I think that's really important in this context is economic institutions and their processes develop organically. Within my experience, the rules and regulations governing them adapted to deal with the perceptions of the prevailing crisis. We're constantly looking over our shoulder. So, what about savings and investment and the savings and investment system in the UK? Right at the heart of a modern capitalist economy are two key functions: the ability to collectivise savings and then transform them into capital that finances economic activity and generates growth. Do that in a sustained way and you deliver rising incomes either through increased employment or productivity, sometimes both, and increased wealth for savings through the returns on their investment. The combination of all three helps to determine the pace of prosperity. Put simply, turning savings into successful investments powers future prosperity. What could be a more important social purpose for our financial system? Indeed, if you believe Randall Mork, the social purpose of the financial system is to entrust people's savings to firms governed by trustworthy people. While we are by no means perfect, we should at least acknowledge our financial system's a lot safer than it was in 2008. Barriers to entry for firms and individuals are robust. Prudential solvency and supervision of providers and individuals are much improved, even though some of us in the industry didn't really care for it very much. However, whilst the system is arguably safer for savers, that doesn't mean the system is doing the second and most arguably important part of its role well. Compare and contrast for the moment the dismal trends in productivity and investment that we've talked about with the 81% increase in assets managed by investment managers in the UK over the last 10 years. These are largely the assets of insurance companies, pension funds, and investment managers, and so should be available to finance some of that much needed investment. It's clear from that data that the current system has been very successful has been very successful in developing the mechanisms for collectivizing savings from simple banks or mutual fund savings account to highly leveraged risk-seeking or hedge funds. At a very superficial level, there's no apparent shortage of money available to be invested in our future prosperity. Let me calibrate that for you. At the end of 2024, according to the Investment Association, there was about £10 trillion sterling available to be invested in the UK, or was invested, money managed in the UK. Money GDP in 2024 was 2.6 trillion. So the amount of assets available is 4 times the underlying economic activity. If you simply say that investment accounts for about 20% of that money GDP, then the multiple available should be massive. So it's one thing to collect savers' money on a well-governed balance sheet to make capital available. It's an entirely different thing to invest it and generate a robust return. As Keynes rather poetically pointed out, the social purpose of skilled investment is to defeat the dark forces of time and ignorance which envelop our future. So why, if ample capital is available, is it not being utilised to finance productive capital? The UK's modern financial architecture, infrastructure and regulation, of course, are the result of a host of well-intentioned policies put in place over the last 40 years. Some have been very beneficial for the banking system and beyond. Prudential solvency, stress testing, resolution regimes, and the supervision that we've talked about of individual behaviours are much improved, bringing greater resilience across the system. However, some of the policies put in place have had unfortunate and unintended consequences. At best, they fostered the impression of perpetual change rather than stability, actually reducing confidence in the financial system. At worst, their interaction has put in place a set of long-term incentives that's had a potentially toxic impact on the supply of funds available for long-term riskier investments. I'd call out 4 as having the largest impact. Scrapping of advanced corporation tax and pension fund tax credits on dividends in 1997, which not only signalled the end of the cult of equity, but removed the tax advantage of owning equity and receiving dividends for long-term institutions. Second, the introduction in 2001 of an accounting change that forced companies to mark the assets of the defined benefit schemes to market on their balance sheet created a massive incentive for company sponsors to shift that liability off their balance sheet and for trustees to transfer investment and payment risk to insurance companies as the scheme matures and members retired. This really accelerated the transfer of investment risk from corporations to individuals. Aligned with that, there was the introduction again in 2001 of risk-based solvency for insurance and pension schemes in the UK. Whilst this undoubtedly did result in an improvement in prudential solvency, it also delivered a significant increase in the pro-cyclicality of insurance assets, particularly those from the UK. It also sadly led to the creation of the market for liability-driven investments, which in fact were anything but, and put the foundations in place for, guess what, November 22. Fourth factor is the deep risk aversions exhibited by policymakers, politicians, and regulators in the wake of the financial crisis. Each of those first 3 has a strong intellectual condition and probably had a strong case for application in its own field. However, the unintended consequences of combining all 3 has had a toxic effect on the supply of long-term funds available for riskier investments. Partly unfortunate timing, just as those measures were beginning to have their biggest impact, the financial crisis took hold, and we were then followed by a decade of exceptionally low inflation with interest rates close to zero. In this environment, the valuation of liabilities soared, as did demand for risk-free assets that in the new solvency regimes played in such high regard. Again, in doing that, it created the preconditions for the instability in the bond markets witnessed in 2022. The impact on the supply of UK long-term capital for domestic risky assets has been devastating, particularly for equity. Life insurance and pension funds back in 1997 owned about 46% of the domestic equity market. By the end of 2024, that was around 4%. The UK equity market, like the rest of the economy, has now become very dependent on overseas capital. So, for me, the restoration of a risk-based culture that revives the long-term appetite for equity risk, in my view, is essential if we are to start improving the prospects for productivity. First step on the road is to accept, actually, this is not just a technical solution. Culture and conduct are powerful tools. They not only influence behaviors, but the incentives they embed within the system can have profound impacts. It's abundantly clear from the UK's experience that seemingly modest, well-intentioned and sometimes technical changes to incentives have powerful impacts on behaviors, but it takes a long time before their force is felt. That kind of raises the question then, okay, we need to affect change. Where do you start? The work I've been doing with something called New Capital Consensus suggests a number of small but targeted intervention. The highest level, we need a review of the UK's regulatory architecture and its modus operandi. At a more practical level, we need greater consolidation of the remaining defined benefit schemes and the ability for the super funds created to operate under pension fund rules rather than Solvency II, which may facilitate enhanced investment freedom. We need to look at removing or revising the daily liquidity requirements in defined contribution schemes, and more importantly, put greater emphasis on a return-enhancing strategic core within these funds rather than a risk-averse default funds for those who are unable or unwilling to make investment choices. We also need to equilibrate the tax incentives attached to equity and debt. These are small steps, but potentially strong signals that are designed to boost the ownership of the riskiest, most junior component of a company's capital structure, which is so important to a business's ability to make long-term investment decisions. In that sense, they're aimed at the delivery of primary capital for business and the lengthening of the horizon of those holding capital in the secondary market. They sit alongside the improvement in the listing rules aimed at attracting capital to London. I would argue are more important. London's role as a marketplace for capital is vital, but it's equally important that if we bring companies to list, they bring economic substance. It's interesting on this next slide just to look at the UK and the United States, 10 big global brands, all of whom are listed in their domestic equity market. Two things stand out. First, the domestic employment content is much higher for US companies. Second, their age profile is much younger. And third, as a consequence, they point to a greater dynamism given the prevalence of the technology sectors. The final and most important point I think I would like to make is that an effective risk culture is not just about owning financial assets, it's about burden sharing and trust. Capitalism, as we've seen, has been very effective at collectivizing savings and turning those savings into capital for investment. It's actually been less good at ensuring the returns are shared in a manner that sustains the whole system and leaves the politicians and the tax system to think about how those returns are distributed. That's increasingly odd because the modern capitalist is more often than not providing capital through their pension fund or investment funds. So the majority are workers, taxpayers, as well as capitalists. This raises, I think, in my book, some real issues about the institutional arrangements embodied in the UK labour market. And of course, one of the problems I think that people worry about is the big decline in the labour share of income. Workers, in my view, need to be treated more like owners. And we need to find mechanisms that ensure that the financial return that's available out in the marketplace is available, because as Thomas Piketty quite rightly suggested, the trend equity return is, over the last 150 years, a significant uplift on the rate of growth of wages. This shouldn't be about redistribution and tax. It should be about ensuring how there is the appropriate degree of burden sharing. Workers need to be treated more like owners. Why not have workers on the board? Why not have an AGM that's delivered to the workforce? Certainly when I was running a company, they were your most fierce critics, and doing that ahead of a formal AGM would help. There's a whole body of literature that kind of looks at that. I think Charlie Bean and Nick Crafts worked out over 20 years ago that actually if you didn't have a multiplicity of unions looking to drive a wage bargaining in the UK, and you're just dealing with one particular set of forces, the outcome was in a much more sensible place. Marty Weitzman, God rest his soul, wrote a really interesting book called The Share Economy, and argued at the end of the 70s that the way forward of dealing with stagflation was actually to make sure that there was a greater symbiosis between labour and capital. I don't have an effective solution. I do think that that conversation really needs to start, because that would define modern capitalism. And it's really important that it gets embedded in a systemic way rather than being under the control of politicians. It will take a long time. Long here is measured in terms of decades, not years or parliaments. Policy makers and politicians, I hope, will take note when embarking on any quick fix or change. The complex and deeply interlinked relationship that characterise the UK financial system are full of systemic impacts, and the impact of any change needs to be assessed through full consultation with anybody that's likely to be involved. Finally, let me quickly finish on the importance of narrative and its influence on behaviours. I don't think should be underestimated. Politicians have really kind of long understood that, but economists are really just starting to get to grip with its impact. The power of narrative will surely only increase with AI and social media take an even firmer grip. We need a powerful narrative to promote the benefits of savings, in investing, and build, for me, a culture around stewardship. Stewardship should lie at the centre of financial and economic life. Asset gatherers are the stewards of savers' funds and need simple, transparent and cost-effective propositions to deliver returns that allow the vast majority of individuals, not just a privileged few, to cope financially with life's trials and tribulations. Investors are the stewards of the assets they manage and have fiduciary responsibility to their clients about their ability to deliver return and help meet those savers' aspirations. Companies and boards of directors are stewards of the capital they're allocated, the assets they acquire with it, and the return delivered to investors and the ultimate client savers. Finally, policymakers also need to recognize they are stewards of the economic and financial system. They should take a long-run approach to its health rather than reaching for short-term fixes. This way, we can rebuild and reinvigorate the risk culture society needs and deliver the financial system with a social purpose it deserves, but put in place a modern capitalism that will help sustain improving prosperity for all. I'm afraid it'll take a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. I'm going to ask one really quick question because we have a number of amazing economists in the room, but I want to ask a question of politics. Has the UK welfare state failed? And by that, if we think about when Beveridge designed the foundations of the modern UK welfare state, it was about effectively supporting workers and adjusting for those on the margins, but ultimately about fostering a sense of work and commitment and participation. And now the modern welfare state, and this is not exclusive to the UK, seems less about fostering work and fostering participation and more about paying those that are young and able to not work when they should be contributing and being part of this vibrant society that I think the UK has the potential to be and has been.
Yeah, yes, I think it's failed in three senses. One, a very short-term sense. Actually, if you look at the data, the lowest decile of incomes in the UK in 2023 and 2024 actually saw a fall in their incomes. So the support is not even being provided, arguably, to those that need it most. For me, the biggest issue is that point about trying to make sure there's a support mechanism in place that actually allows you at times of stress and at times of change to reskill and be prepared to make sure that you are looked after and that you are given a set of skills that allow you to participate in the economy of tomorrow. You know, places like Denmark, I believe, do this really well. The third sense in which it's failed is that big increase in the public debt GDP ratio, which is a structural problem, is in part an issue of welfare. We simply can't continually borrow, not just from the rest of the world, but from our future to pay for today. So I think, we need something akin to a new Beveridge. This isn't just about slashing and burning, it's about changing the system.
Absolutely. I think it's good that you say that it's not about slashing and burning, but it seems that when you talk about reforming welfare systems, people always assume that it's about slash and burn, and it's not. It's actually about finding those mechanisms where those in most need are supported, but the system ultimately is a contributory system where everyone is contributing to a thriving economy. And it's, as you said, it's that burden sharing and having joint equity ownership. I mean, Peter Drucker wrote in the 70s, pension fund socialism, which is better would have been pension fund capitalism, where the workers are also the owners and they benefit. And so I'm sure we have some amazing questions for Sir Keith. So please don't hesitate to raise your hand. Take Arnab in the back. Please wait for the microphone.
All right, I'll stand up here. Arnab Bhattacharjee, Head at Water University and NIESR. This is brilliant. Thank you very much. Two quick questions. The first one is, if there needs to be longer, horizon policy making, that needs a certain disjuncture of policy making from the electoral cycle. How are we going to get there? So that is question number one. Question number two, we have the National Institute have argued for some time now, and we completely agree with you that rising risk aversion is an issue, is a serious issue. But this also being an university space, let me take the dial a bit backwards and say that, well, okay, so if some people were to, businesses were to take risk, you need a sufficient pool of high risk, potentially high return investment opportunities. And that then requires a pool of knowledge which is ready so that it can be potentially capitalized. But we have potentially, and both the epochs that you mentioned earlier, where we made that turnaround, there were those that knowledge available. But it doesn't seem that that is the case that we are in at the moment. If at all, AI is low risk rather than high risk. We need high risk, high return investment opportunities. So how are we going to use the university system and the knowledge generation system, turn it around to produce these opportunities for us? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Terrific questions. Yeah, the first one is absolutely critical. So I would say it requires a degree of openness and honesty in the political class about the situation we find ourselves in. There are examples of the rest of the world where things have been dire, they've ended up, and things are much better. Ireland is probably a pretty good case in point post the financial crisis. What we can't continually do is pick a series of ratios or data points and then promise and hope that's the way. Actually, I think that destroys credibility rather than improving it. So a real sense and dose of realism is required. And I don't think that's just the politicians. I think the economics community and the investment community have a role to play in this, because the media will just chase the next story. The issue about universities is a great one. One of the things that when I was looking through this data and thinking about this, there was a whole load of stuff on intangible capital. I was trying to get my head round and try to bring it in, but it would have been far too long. The one kind of stat that I did note was, if you look at where the UK ranks around the world in terms of creativity and software development, we're actually up there. I think we're number 4 or 5, possibly in the top 3. We kind of need to take a leaf out of bits of Sweden's book. The issue for me, and it's been a perpetual problem with the UK economy, is we have a scale-up problem. There are no technology companies in that list, because guess what? The ones that were really good have been bought up and disappeared elsewhere because the capital's been provided and they've been scaled up. So we need to think deeply about how we scale up, how we increasingly manage and marry town and gown. I think the other thing that's really important is we have become, I think, as an economy, as a society, a little bit over-obsessed about listing and PLC-dom and what that says. Actually, it's much, much better, as William Baumol pointed out, so good capitalism, bad capitalism. Actually, good capitalism is something that has a diversity of corporate structures. I've worked in a PLC, a partnership, and a mutual. It's about time we started celebrating those alternative structures, those alternative ways of burden sharing. I saw something in the paper today that pointed out that if you look at the cooperatives, the mutuals in the UK, actually they're employing more people. I think they've risen by 5 or 6% per annum over the last few decades. So other means of getting some diversity into our kind of corporate system, many ways to generate growth.
Owen, and then the question up
I have to say, if the mic's working, I really liked the talk. Very enjoyable. It reminded me of Nick Crafts. But what I wanted to ask you was if my interpretation is correct, your advice is kind of some supply side reforms. And when Nick Crafts was looking at the lessons from the 50s to 70s, he emphasized supply side reforms, but in later life, he emphasized the benefits of joining the European Union. And he said, like, at the time, people thought the benefits of joining the EU would be very low. Turned out ex post, they were very high. And the other thing, though, that he didn't mention, and which coincides with your entry into the workforce, is North Sea oil, which has kind of ended. So these are two things I just want your thoughts on. Is basically, well, can I just end? The the division of labour is limited by the extent of the market, and if we've kind of withdrawn from a big market, would it be beneficial to rejoin that market at some point?
I was hands up. I was a Remainer. I never saw any reason to leave. I thought it would generate, and it has significant dislocation. The economist in me says, well, analytically, if we're going to join, what are the costs? What are the benefits? I think at some point the UK will join, but I think it should only rejoin when it can be a strong voice in shaping the way in which the EU talks about the future of its markets and the way in which it thinks about that savings investment nexus. At the moment, it is pretty directive. I think there are things that we could start doing in the UK that, if we can provide, first of all, the intellectual way forward, and then put that into practice, then we can have an impact. We can be invited. We could be invited back in. We might get better terms. Thank you for the compliment about Nick Crafts. If nobody's read it, there's a fantastic little back book called Falling Behind, Forging Ahead, and it's a really good history of the institutional arrangements within the UK. The only other thing I would add, and I actually think Smith understood this, markets are created by people, and the rules and regulations that govern them are shaped by social mores and people. We have it in our gift to change some of those things, and I think it's absolutely critical and important we do, and we start the debate.
There was a question about North Sea oil that Owen asked.
I guess they're kind of two issues to that. Yes, North Sea oil had a really, really powerful impact. And one of the big issues with North Sea oil was, we saw the benefits in the production stats, we saw the benefits in the tax revenue. We did not do what Norway did and build up a huge sovereign wealth fund that actually looked to deliver a return. I think we're a kind of Johnny come lately. So, North Sea oil, I think, was a resource that effectively was wasted by the UK.
We have time for one more question. Front first.
Two very quick questions. One is, can you see us heading towards an AI bubble akin to the late 90s .com bubble at some point with lots of promises and actually it could all fall apart? And secondly, as someone who's about to embark on a freelance consultancy career in 3 weeks, could you give me some reasons to be cheerful?
Well, the second one's really easy. Yeah? There's nothing economists like more and consultants like more than a noise and a mess. So, you know, there's plenty to do, and there's kind of plenty to clear up. Sorry, the first was?
About AI, potential bubble in AI.
I think in some of the companies at the moment, you know, if you look at the valuation of NVIDIA in particular, and some of the other hyperscalers, there's almost a bubble in asset pricing going on at the moment. The difference between today and what people tend to think about the .com bubble was we had this bubble in valuations when there were no earnings. Actually, if you look at the stream of cash flows and the earnings of the hyperscalers, maybe they're justifying a relatively high PE ratio. The real issue for me is a bit like what went on with telcos and the various licensing. You know, you look at the amount of money that's being thrown at data centers and the increasing cost of those data centers and the impact on energy costs, and you really do wonder whether too much capacity is being put in place. If there's too much capacity being put in place and these data centers don't go at full utilization, then there's an awful lot of sunk costs that's going to cause an issue. You know, is it a bubble that's about to burst? No, not at the moment. Is there a valuation issue over the long run? Yes. The other thing is, what happens if some new technology comes along? What happens if quantum computing suddenly cracks things? Do we really need these data centers? Do we still need all of those chips? Actually, you know, you kind of look at those kind of structural issues, you know, and you know, so as Cho and Lai said, you know, the jury's out.
Please join me in thanking Sir Keith Skeoch for an excellent lecture, the first of the Panmure House NIESR inaugural lecture. Thank you.